Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome and good afternoon to you all. And on behalf of Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, and partners, welcome to this session called Biofuel Development and Forests, Impacts and Implications for Governance. In this session, we have two groups of presentations, 3 presentations in each, and then in between we have, or after these presentations, we have some time for questions and comments. And what we are presenting here is basically results of a research that CIFOR and the partners who are represented here have been carrying out during a couple of years now, 2 or 3 years, on these issues related to biofuel production and forests, and issues related to land use change, livelihoods, and those. And what we do here now is I'll give the floor to the 3 presenters. Each of them have about 10 minutes, or not about, but exactly 10 minutes. And then we have time for discussion. So the first presenter will be Francis Johnson from Stockholm Environment Institute. And the title of his presentation is Evolution of Biofuels Markets under the EU RED, Land Use, Trade and Energy Climate Policy Implications.
Thank you. We're going to move fast in this session, so what I'll do in this first part is basically give a very fast guided tour of the key issues. And in particular, of interest to this group is the relation between land use and trade, and the sustainability criteria in with regard to the EU Renewable Energy Directive. So I'll make some comments about the current shape of the markets, and the issue of direct and indirect land use change, the certification process, what role trade regimes have played or could play, and then a little bit about what can be done about it, what can be done to reduce the impacts, but at the same time to not close off the opportunities for developing countries to access this market and to get the benefits available through trade. So what are the drivers and pressures? Well, these are similar across both in the EU, but also globally and in developing countries. Energy security, agricultural development, rural development, also import substitution. And so as these drivers have really come to the fore in the past 5 years, we've seen also the pressures at the same time for more land, more resources, more water, the substitution for food crops, also changing lifestyles, which is affecting the demand for biomass and for animal feed and other biomass products. So there's concern about deforestation, food security, water stress, loss of biodiversity. And so the response has come in the form of sustainability criteria, also in some cases moratoria on additional land use for bioenergy, but also the role of free trade in moving the global bioenergy market towards those who are most efficient, both in land use and in economic terms, but also lower environmental impacts. And it's many countries now that have renewable energy targets. So it's not just the EU, it's becoming a global market now, whereas previously it was really just a national market in most parts of the world. So the development globally is really focused in 3 regions, EU, Brazil, and US. So the biofuel consumption has increased by more than a factor of 5 during the past 10 years. And so there's really still these 3 markets that are having the main impact. China, the market in China is increasing in some other regions, but still for the next 5 or 10 years it will continue to be these three main producers and consumers. So what about the EU Renewable Energy Directive? Also the Fuel Quality Directive, because the criteria apply to both pieces of legislation. It's a 10% share of renewable energy in transport that all member states have to meet, but biofuels have to meet sustainability criteria, and there's a minimum greenhouse gas reduction of 35%. This will increase to 50% 2017. There are no-go areas, including forests, biodiverse grasslands, also wetlands and any protected areas. And there's a whole slew of requirements in terms of proving sustainability, and there are default values for all the different biofuels. So it's fairly complex legislation. There's also some incentives for biofuels from degraded lands, which I'll mention a little bit later. So what about the market for trade? Because the big difference between the EU and the other regions is that the EU is participating much more in international trade. So in fact, in the case of bioethanol, 40% of the 40% of net imports are going to the EU, or the EU has that share for bioethanol. For biodiesel, it's 90%. So the EU is the main player when it comes to international trade. The US market is mainly for domestic consumption, and Brazil is a net exporter, not an importer, of course. And the makeup of EU imports is quite different for bioethanol versus biodiesel. It's bioethanol coming mainly from Brazil, but also from USA when Brazil cannot has to meet its own domestic requirements, and for biodiesel, especially soya-based biodiesel from Argentina, and also palm oil-based from Indonesia. So something about the costs incurred in sustainability certification, because this determines which countries are going to be able to export to the EU and how trade can grow, where is it constrained, and so forth. There's a tendency to focus on really the direct costs of certification, which is item 1 and 5 in this list, the fees and the auditing costs. But in fact, you have a lot of indirect costs, adapting to new processes, information costs, changes in management systems. These costs are typically much higher, but they're very uncertain because this market has only developed over the past few years. So it remains to be seen which producing countries can actually, especially among the least developed countries, can meet the requirements, or that is to say, to absorb these costs. And so there's a concern that the EU is shifting the costs onto some countries that cannot afford it. So indirect land use change is rather different from direct land use change. Direct land use being associated with conversion just before or the clearing of land for biofuels use. This is not permitted under the EU RED, so countries that cannot prove otherwise will not be able to export to the EU. But indirect land use change occurs when there's a compensation for the additional land needed to compensate for food production. So those feedstocks that have low yields are going to have much higher indirect impacts. But this provision of the has not been invoked in the EU RED, and a decision is delayed actually till 2013. The use of degraded lands is an interesting approach, perhaps, to minimize indirect land use change. Since these lands are not in current use for food, so it offers an opportunity to reduce land pressures. Just to put this in broader perspective then, the development of the biofuels market is going to require greater efficiency in agriculture. Otherwise, it's not going to work. More than 1/3 of arable land is already occupied by agricultural crops, and there's increasing demand for animal feeds and other biomass uses. And it remains to be seen when second-generation biofuels will come in. There will be very little before 2020 when the EU Directive is running out. Also, the possibility for integrated uses and the use of residues and co-products. This can also reduce land pressures. So the use of degraded lands, a very interesting possibility, but requires a considerable amount of investment before new areas can be developed. A review of 6 studies suggested pretty significant potential, actually amounting to about between 4 and 50 times the EU projected consumption in 2020. But how to motivate or how to incentivize this development, because the current credit in the directive is very small. It's equivalent to about 10 to 80 euros per hectare, which is very small. So it seems that at the moment land that is highly contaminated or highly salinated, which is the language in the directive, it will be very difficult to make very much use. So just to wrap up, the EU market has actually a very significant impact on trade flows. It's the key import market. There's still a big effect of preferential tariffs and quotas, and the sustainability criteria, they do address reasonably well direct land use change, but indirect land use change is still not accounted for under the directive. Voluntary certification has been the focus so far, but in fact, there are other costs. There are costs that will accrue to, especially to least developed countries and small farmers, that could make it difficult and will slow the increase in trade. The degraded lands incentives does not appear to be sufficient, so it's something that could be developed further. Finally, there's an interesting possibility in the future to consider bilateral agreements, which is another way to meet the sustainability criteria under the directive. And this could allow to maybe unleash some of the benefits of free trade in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and exactly 10 minutes. I go directly to the next speaker, Jan Willem van Gelder from Profundo Economic Research. And the topic is biofuel finance and investments, trends and implications for forests. Jan Willem.
Yes. Well, good afternoon. I want to take you through a study we did on financing of biofuel. We undertook 20 case studies. A little bit higher, yeah. We undertook 20 case studies on financing of biofuel in forest-rich countries. 16 countries in total, 4 types of feedstocks: sugarcane, jatropha, palm oil, and soy, spread over these 16 countries. And we looked at all investments in feedstock growing and then corrected for the percentage of the crop which is actually used for biofuel, which can be very different for different crops. And based on this methodology, we found in these 20 case studies a total investment in the past 10 years of 5.3 until $7.3 billion. And the lion's share of these investments go into the growing of palm oil in Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia, and sugarcane in Brazil. Investments in other feedstocks dedicated to biofuel production are much smaller, especially for jatropha, which was included in 7 case studies. The investments were relatively small, 175 to $290 million. This is in the feedstock growing itself. And then if you look at conversion into biofuel, the refining and conversion into biofuel, only in 7 out of these 20 case study countries, we found investment actually in producing of biofuel, with a total investment of 5.7 to 6.7 billion, of which 2/3 is in sugar-based ethanol, especially in Brazil, but also in some countries in Africa. 1/3 is in biodiesel from soy and palm oil, and there are hardly any investments in producing biodiesel from jatropha. If we then look at where is all this money coming from, well, there's a wide range of companies involved in both the planting and growing of the feedstocks and in producing the biofuel. And behind these companies is a wide, even broader range of financiers. We have divided them in the domestic group, so the financiers coming from the same countries as in which the feedstock is grown or the biofuel is produced. And you can divide them in the entrepreneurs, so the smaller businesses, the governments, institutional investors, and private banks, all in these production countries. But also a large share of the financing is coming from abroad, from other countries. And these can also be divided in entrepreneurs, governments, institutional investors, private banks, and of course the multilateral banks, such as the World Bank. I won't go into detail because of the time of all forms of financing, but this is the general picture. And if you then look at, in these 20 case studies, we found in total 414 financial institutions involved, which a large part from Asia Pacific. The blue ones are the ones which invest in their own country. So some of the case study countries are in Asia, so financial institutions invested in their own countries. The red ones are financial institutions from Asia investing in other countries in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America. And as you see, Europe and North America also quite a large number of financial institutions invest in these case study countries, which are all in the developing world. Multilaterals play a small part, although in numbers, only a few multilaterals are involved. And then if we look more at the importance of financiers, we try to assess that. How important are different group of financiers in different regions? We also did it on a commodity basis, but to keep it simple, we focus on the regions here, and the pattern is fairly clear that if you look at the first column, Africa, then you see the big dots in the categories of foreign financiers. So much of the developments in biofuel growing, feedstock growing and biofuel production are financed by foreign financiers like private banks, institutional investors and governments. While in Asia there's a much larger role, and also in Latin America, of domestic financiers. So you see in the second and the third column, you see the larger dots on the upper side, on the domestic part. Asia also has some influence of foreign banks and institutional investors, while in Latin America this is relatively limited. So this is the pattern of which financiers are financing in these regions biofuel developments. And if we then look at the future, then significant new investments are anticipated. The global market will grow, as Francis already explained. A broad range of companies will step into this. Startup companies, larger agricultural companies, and also companies from other sectors, like companies from the oil industry, stepping into this industry. Behind these companies will be an even broader range of financiers, governments, entrepreneurs, banks, and institutional investors. And there is a possibility for these financiers to leverage sustainable development, strengthen economic development while respecting biodiversity and local communities, provided that these financiers adopt responsible biofuel investment policies, which many of them have not done yet, and improve the quality of their policies. So what do we mean by improved quality? Our research shows that 5 issues are relevant for this, 5 quality criteria. So the first one is that a financial institution in its investment policies adopts principles, criteria and indicators which are based on international accepted standards, and also on standards which are measurable, reportable and verifiable. Further, in its policy, the mechanisms for monitoring and compliance should be there. And it should be applied to all forms of financing, as well as to all companies active in the sector. For multilateral banks, often many of the policies, their policies meet these criteria, but many of the other financiers still have a long way to go. Financiers can, of course, adopt such policies on a voluntary basis. They can also be stimulated to do so by their customers or by their shareholders. But also they can be stimulated to do so by governments. And you can make a difference between the producer country governments and the consumer country governments. The producer country governments could develop biofuel policies for all forms of public finance. So a significant part, especially in Asia and Latin America, is coming from, is financed by the governments of these countries themselves in the form of subsidies, national development banks, state-owned companies. So there's a big role for the governments of these countries to develop sound biofuel financing policies. But there's also a role for consumer countries or other countries outside Asia, Latin America and Africa to develop good financing policy which might be similar to their policies which exist for biofuel imports, like the EU RED, but do not exist as such for foreign public finance. So policies could be applied to export credits, to development loans, foreign development banks, but also by the investments by state-owned companies. Example, the Italian state-owned company investing large scale in palm oil in Congo. Applying policies to those type of investments would certainly help. And then governments could stimulate biofuel policies among pension funds and banks on a voluntary basis, and they could stimulate them also as well to adopt independent compliance and grievance mechanisms to be able to correct the policies. And then finally, in a more regulatory framework, governments could also change the financial sector regulation on these issues by integrating sustainability risks in risk management under the Basel III agreements, and also to apply, introduce mandatory sustainability reporting. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan Willem. And then the last speaker of this first part, Neil Bird from Uranium Research, about carbon accounting options, description, evaluation, and implications.
Thank you very much, Markku. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Markku just mentioned, the task for our group at UNM Research was to look at carbon accounting options for bioenergy. I will move very quickly forward as we don't have a lot of time. As you may know, in the existing accounting system, bioenergy emissions are not counted in the energy sector. They are counted in the land use sector if there is a carbon stock change or losses. And the reasoning behind this actually is quite interesting. If you go back and look at some of the thoughts on this, is that it's simple, it's very easy to calculate. Bioenergy over the life cycle can be sustainable, so the carbon stock losses may balance out over time. And in fact, in many cases, there's a lot less information about bioenergy and its consumption than the use of fossil energy. So that was the reasoning behind it. But as we've found out over the last little while, it might be good reasoning, but it's imperfect in an imperfect world. And specifically, this issue of partial participation. And that means that since there is partial participation, the bioenergy consumer may consume biomass and create an emission where the land where it came from might not be part of the accounting system. And for this reason, the concept of accounting systems for bioenergy are at the moment undergoing reevaluation. There's a discussion going on in the US EPA on how to account for emissions from stationary sources. And as Francis already mentioned, the EU Renewable Energy Directive is still trying to decide how to account for the implications of indirect land use change in their accounting system. Schematically, the emissions from bioenergy systems are shown here. You have potentially biogenic CO2 through growth and oxidation producing biomass on the surface. There may be fossil carbon used to cultivate the biomass. There also may be non-CO2 greenhouse gases from things like fertilizer use. The biomass is produced. It may be converted into a fuel at that point in time. That is transferred to the consumer, and the consumer then consumes or burns the bioenergy, releasing the CO2 that was transferred back into the atmosphere. There may be some emissions associated from fossils due to transportation, and also non-CO2s by the consumer as well. So the question is how do we decide where these arrows, this is how they actually occur in the accounting system. The question is, where do we allocate them between the producer and the consumer? And in our study, we decided that there were three basic approaches. The current approach, where CO2 emissions are not counted at the point of combustion, they're not counted in the energy sector. Or the alternative is that they are counted at the point of combustion. And then this would, if this occurred, then biomass would be handled exactly the same way as fossil fuels. The CO2, when burnt, would occur there. A third alternative is that we try to bring all the CO2 emissions along the bioenergy value chain to the responsibility of the end users. I won't go into details again because of time. But what we described in our work is potential, these basic systems and modifications on them through policy overlays and things like that, and then tried to evaluate them under some specific criteria. On the first slide I'm going to show you here, on this side we have the various accounting systems that we described. The top one here, unmodified, is the existing system. And across the top are some criteria from which you may be able to judge if the accounting system is appropriate. And these are space and time, and what we mean here are we being comprehensive in calculating and capturing as much of the CO2 emissions as we can. Simplicity, that's always a nice thing to have. Having it simple makes everyone understand it better. And when we considered simplicity, we also considered that changing from the existing system would make things more inherently more complicated, or it's simplest to stay with the system that everyone knows. And scalability, can you use it at the project level and at the national level? As well, we tried to evaluate the impacts on stakeholder goals. Let me go back, sorry, I missed something that I wanted to talk about here. I said this is the existing system, and you can see that because of this problem with partial participation, it has low criteria over space and time. Of course, we're keeping the same system, so it has high in simplicity. The alternative that we were discussing a whole bunch was this thing called POR, which we called point of uptake and release. That means that the person that produces the biomass may get a credit for capturing the biomass or sequestering it in the plants, and the person that uses it would then get a debit because they were combusting the biomass. Our feeling was that this had a much better value over comprehensiveness, specifically in partial systems, but it lacks in simplicity. It's much more complicated. So then let me go on to the next set of trying to understand how this affects stakeholder goals. Does it create incentives or disincentives? And our criteria here are listed across the top again. Does it stimulate rural economies, promote food security, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and preserve forests? And essentially what we came up with was that the accounting systems either tend to promote bioenergy use from the consumer or, but the other side, create disincentives. And again, not going through the whole range here, and just looking at the unmodified, we felt that, as you can see, that it promoted bioenergy, which means that it has the potential to stimulate rural economies, but at the potentially potentially having less of an incentive to protect food security and reduce greenhouse gas emissions because of this partial participation. The POR system we felt was better for many reasons, but it depends a whole bunch on the details of the accounting system. And I would like you to look at the documents that we provided to fulfill you in with those kind of things. But the most important thing is that there's a transfer mechanism that's developed from the producer who creates credits potentially and the user who has debits, so that there's some kind of transfer mechanism in place. So in conclusion, there are alternatives to the current systems are being contemplated. We say there's essentially three types of systems. One's where bioenergy has no emissions in the energy sector. They're counted in the land use sector. One where the bioenergy combustion actually has an emission in the energy sector, and one where the bioenergy emissions follow the value chain. Now, there are disadvantages and advantages of all three. The zero combustion factor, or the existing system, is simple and comprehensive if all parties are involved. The problem is all parties may not be involved. It tends to promote bioenergy use. The one combustion factor, that's where the emissions are counted at the point of combustion, is more complicated. It would require renegotiation of our agreements. It tends to be more comprehensive, but it may not promote bioenergy because the user no longer has this incentive for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. and depending on the system that's involved, it may stimulate rural economies directly. But there are implications, of course, of this. One of them is the locations of where emissions are accounted will move around. And that means that we are changing potentially the mitigation responsibilities by nations, which needs to be included when we start talking about targets. There's also issues about timing of emissions, and I won't go into that at this point, but that also creeps into this discussion. And the important thing is that, hopefully not, but in reality, we should be looking at accounting systems that work best under partial participation. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Neil, for your presentation. And now I open the floor for questions and comments. So please, I think we have a microphone here. So please raise your hand if you want to pose a question or make a comment. And please introduce yourselves when you're using the microphone. The floor is open. Oh, over there, lady.
Thank you very much. I thought that was a comprehensive overview of clearly a lot of information very quickly. My name is Deborah Scott. I'm from the Department of Geography at Rutgers University in the U.S. I had a question for the first presenter. I think it's Francis. And just at the very end, you were talking about that bilateral agreements could be explored to unleash some of the benefits of free trade. And that, I wasn't sure what exactly you mean by that. Certainly in talking about the direct and even more the indirect land use implications of biofuels, it seems like there's a need for quite a number of safeguards to be involved. So I'm just wondering what free trade would look like in that case. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Maybe there is one more or two more so that I can get a couple of questions at one time. Over here, at least. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Ngari. I come from Kenya. I work for a civil society organization that is conservation-based. I want to ask the gentleman who presented on the 20 case studies. There appears that there is no much that is going towards promotion of jatropha or investment in jatropha. Is it that jatropha is not looking attractive, or there are projections that investments could go to that direction very soon? I ask this because in Kenya we have a lot of investors who are coming into our country, and they are looking into getting big pieces of land. And these investors are coming especially from Europe. And I think the Red Directive is the one that is fueling this mass movement of investors into Africa, and especially Kenya. Thanks.
Thank you. And one more there in the back.
Yes, I'm Peg Putt from Global Witness, and my question is for Neil Bird in relation to accounting for bioenergy and its emissions profile. I'd like to put the case that until we do something to account for bioenergy in the energy sector preferably, then we've got a perverse incentive for bioenergy that may in fact be quite highly emissive, and it's just not getting onto the books because of the way the Kyoto accounting rules are constructed. In developed countries under LULUCF, land use change and forestry, there's a loophole in relation to accounting for logging. That is, it's pick and choose, and only some parties choose to do so. Generally, they don't when it's emissive. And similarly for cropland management, it's pick and choose, and almost no parties have chosen that. So we're not capturing those emissions there, and we're not capturing them in the energy sector either. In relation to any feedstocks that are coming from developing countries, they're not being accounted for, obviously, because it's not the job of developing countries to do that. Yet there may be substantial emissions profiles associated with that bioenergy, not only in its production, but of course in its combustion. And where that's being incentivized through policy in developed countries, particularly like the Renewable Energy Directive in the EU, then we really have a problem that the countries that are burning that energy are not accounting for it. And if we don't fix that, we're not actually going to be promoting good sources over more emissive sources of bioenergy, and we're going to end up in a real pickle.
Thank you so much. We have one question per one each presenter. So let's start with Francis.
Yeah, with regard to bilateral agreements, I should say first that there are 3 ways to prove sustainability, to prove that the biofuels are sustainable according to the EU directive. One is through a voluntary scheme, one is through a scheme of a national member state of EU, and the third is a bilateral agreement with some other country. So when during the past 5 years or so, somewhere around approximately 80 different voluntary schemes emerged. Now this creates a lot of confusion when you have 80 different schemes, and so naturally there is a process going on now to try to focus on the most reputable of these voluntary schemes. At the same time, some of these are going to be challenged at the WTO because they fall a little bit outside of they could fall outside of the framework, whereas a bilateral agreement would fall within the WTO. So I guess when I say that bilateral agreements could unleash the efficiency, this is not to say that they don't have their own problems. Some of them, you know, perhaps just as problematic. But the point I was making is that they haven't really been explored yet, because the one advantage of them also is that they could cover also the domestic uses of those biofuels in that third country, because hopefully they're not going to create a different standard for their domestic biofuels versus their exported. And it could also cover land use more generally. So it would be interesting to explore how they would work, because that hasn't really been done yet. That's really what I meant.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, on the Jatropha, Kenya was not part of our case study, so I'm not sure about the exact situation in this country, but we look at some other countries, 7, in which Jatropha was promoted, and the general pattern you see is that many companies a few years ago came in and secured land and with high expectations and started to plant Jatropha on a limited scale, and then found that under suboptimal conditions the yields of Jatropha were much lower than expected, and that in turn discouraged further investments. Financiers like the ones I tried to list, of course, are looking for the actual results before they step in, and I think that is the explanation why you don't see that much, have seen that much investments in either Jatropha growing or Jatropha biofuel production in the past 10 years. It could maybe pick up in later years if well thought of and placed in the right conditions. But I think you're worried a bit about companies acquiring much land for this. I think you should be critical about that, because the experiences in many countries are not so favorable. But there will be more on Jatropha in Southern Africa in the next panel, in the last presentation.
Thank you so much. Neil?
Yes, thank you for your question, Peg. You're absolutely correct. one normally thinks of only the non-Annex 1 countries that may not be participating as causing this loophole in the bioenergy, but you're absolutely right. It could also occur from Annex 1 countries that have not chosen forest management as part of their commitment and their accounting system, or soil management, because both of these pools can be affected by the increased use of bioenergy. And it's for that real reason that our team favors this POR approach, where the bioenergy is accounted for at the point of consumption, and hopefully there's some kind of mechanism to create credits where at the point where the biomass is accumulated. But the reason really being is that if the point where the biomass is accumulated is not part of the system, then at least you capture the emissions for the consumption. So it tends to be, what I'm going to say, a conservative approach that it will overestimate emissions rather than underestimate emissions in a partial participation scheme.
Thank you so much. Then a couple of questions, comments more? Yes, they're at the back.
Thank you. My name is Jane Gaiduma from BirdLife International, and I came in a bit late, so I didn't get to listen to some of the presentations. But I'd like to ask on the case studies that you presented on, could you indicate to us some of the successful case studies that you came across when you were doing the study? And by this, I mean where the case in point was able to provide benefits locally. So, for example, to the local people, and in terms of emissions, and also in terms of biodiversity conservation, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, the first presentation on the next session is about this issue, so I don't allow these speakers to answer. I'll leave it to the next session. But there is a lady over there.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations. My name's Michelle, I'm from the Centre for International Forestry Research, and I was particularly interested in your presentation, Francis, particularly in the incentives for using degraded land for biofuel development. I was just hoping you could expand a bit more on what is currently being offered as the incentives for biofuel development on degraded land, because you mentioned they're not sufficient, and perhaps you could speculate on what would be required for the EU RED to be able to move forward with this.
Yeah.
Just a moment. I take one more. Last chance. Okay, no more. Please.
Sorry. Thanks for the question. There are two ways in which the degraded land, the use of degraded lands for producing bioenergy are sort of promoted in the directive. One is that in the process of certification, you have to show previous land use and show that you have not cleared forests and other areas. And of course, this part would not be applied to these areas if they can be classified as highly contaminated or highly salinated. That's the language in the directive. That's one way. The second way is there's a credit for greenhouse gas emissions. This is expressed in carbon per unit of energy. And if you translate this into the amount per hectare for for a given carbon price, it comes out to be rather small. Not only that, but in addition to being small, degraded and marginal lands is a complex issue because some lands might be heavily degraded and require a considerable amount of investment. Other lands, particularly salinated, lands, they would be suitable for woody biomass under maybe a wider range of conditions. So there's no differentiation in this credit. It's just one flat amount. So it doesn't really provide a good incentive, and it doesn't appear that very many producers will be able to take advantage of this. As to how it might be improved in the directive, I think it's going to be difficult because land use always has an important local component and a national component. So to try to put something in the directive that's going to apply globally, I think this is going to be difficult. And again, that's why I mentioned this, the unexplored value of bilateral agreements, because they could also include degraded land. And so it's an interesting way forward. Because it hasn't, it hasn't been explored. So I think there is a lot of land that seems to be degraded and potentially available. So how to take advantage of that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you so much. So I thank the speakers and also thank the audience for your patience and those who made questions and comments. Thank you so much. And we move to the second part of this session.
The next session, we've got 3 speakers who are going to give us further insights based on our research over the last 3 years of the impacts associated with the expansion of biofuels and some of the lessons which we've teased out from this research in terms of some of the governance arrangements which have been put in place related to this biofuel expansion. Firstly, it's my pleasure to introduce Laura German as our first speaker. Dr. German has been a senior scientist at C4 for the last 4 years and will be starting a new job at the University of Athens, Georgia in January, but will remain as a senior research associate with C4. And her presentation will explore some of the local, social, and environmental impacts of biofuels in forest frontiers. Laura.
Thank you. So this presentation is going to profile 6 case studies, which was very much based on a collaborative effort with myself, colleagues, as well as partner organizations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's not meant to be representative, and that's an important qualifier. Once you drill down to the national level and then drill down to the landscape level, there's a whole lot of variability, and so that needs to be taken into account when trying to interpret some of our findings. How do I go down here? Okay. I'll start with just a very brief overview of the research approach that we used, zero in on the findings, and then finish with a few comments on implications for governance. The primary research question we addressed was, what are the local social, economic, and environmental impacts of biofuel feedstock production in key forest ecoregions? Methodology included 6 different case study countries, as I mentioned, in different regions of the world. We started with some scoping, both at the national level, to look at possible policy drivers and also the location of different types of investments, different feedstock that were present at the national level. And then also looked at the landscape level to look a little bit at the variability of corporate practices so that we could understand when we drill into specific case studies and specific investments, how does that reflect a wider context? And then as far as the specific investments or plantations that were studied, we did a sampling procedure that tried to look at different business models where they were present. In other words, large-scale commercial plantations as well as smallholder production. That wasn't possible in all countries, but we did it in several. And then also an explicit sampling of different stakeholder groups who are affected differently by the nature of their engagement with the emerging industry. That included land-losing households and employees in the case of commercial plantations, and then also smallholders, smallholder producers. The social impacts methodology consisted of key informant interviews and focus group discussions disaggregated by gender to try to understand, distill key impact variables of importance to different stakeholder groups. So we have a generic survey instrument, but that was nuanced then with issues of importance locally so that we could quantify those impacts. And then finally, for environmental impacts, for the commercial plantations, we did some land use change analysis for all countries except for Brazil, where there was a whole lot of published literature on these impacts, and then also looked at carbon accounting methods, carried out carbon accounting for based on those land use changes. To look first at the environmental impacts of industrial scale plantations, again, to point out that Brazil is a little bit unique, but is included here in this table for the sake of comparison, just to get a sense of how things vary. If we're looking at direct deforestation alone, direct land use change, we're seeing anywhere from 13 in the case of soybean in Mato Grosso in Brazil, which is dry forest landscape, up to over 99% of expansion that is causing deforestation in the case of some sites in Indonesia. So significant variation in terms of the extent of feedstock expansion that's provoking deforestation in these forested or mixed-use landscapes. When looking at carbon payback time, we considered both direct land use change as observed and scenarios of indirect land use change, since this is harder to measure, and came out with carbon payback times anywhere from 18 years to over 200 years, with the longer payback times being associated with those plantations located in peatlands in Southeast Asia. So in the land conversion process, there's a carbon debt that's incurred through an increase in carbon emissions, and how long does it take to recuperate that debt? And again, this was based on a number of case studies by different colleagues. And by the way, this set of case studies is available in a recent special issue of Ecology and Society, most of which are already posted online. Looking at small-scale feedstock production, we looked at this most closely for the case study in Zambia, and based on reported land use changes. And households claim to be converting cropland to biofuels, as well as incorporating biofuel feedstocks into existing cropland, but also converting fallow and mature forest. And based on these reported figures, if we look at direct land use change alone or direct deforestation, about 24% of expansion is occurring at the expense of forest. This is significantly lower than the majority of the industrial scale plantations in forested landscapes. But since it's only one case study, it's very difficult to draw any general conclusions. If we include in that figure indirect land use change, then it increases to about 44%. Now, it's important also to look at the role of yield, and we did this for the case of Zambia, looking at different scenarios that are currently at play in the landscape and the amount of conversion that has been occurred in reality for different large-scale plantations and these small-scale systems, and found that the hectares of mature forest cleared, and in the right-hand column, mature forest and fallow, was higher per unit of crude jatropha oil produced in the smallholder systems, and that's largely due to pitifully low yields. And we also used reported yields, the maximum reported yields in the literature. So yield is a critically important environmental variable when you're talking about smallholder systems, and being able to support smallholders to increase those yields so that you minimize that environmental footprint. That said, it is possible that as yields go up, you also induce more people to engage in that production. So that needs to be considered as a caveat. Looking now at local social and environmental, and economic impacts of industrial scale plantations. For the case of the employee group, we found concrete livelihood improvements in a number of sites due to increased income and access to social services, but mixed or negative impacts in other sites due to poor employment conditions and reality not meeting either promises made to people when they were considering a formal employment or their expectations about what that formal employment might bring. And interestingly, in many sites, one of the most important benefits was in terms of regularity of income flows relative to agriculture and forestry related land uses, which bring highly seasonal income flows. And in some cases, that was regularity of income. That benefit came without the added benefit of net income benefits. And generally, however, generally low employment levels if you consider employment levels relative to displaced land uses. And these figures come from published literature as well as our own work. Looking now at land-losing households, this was by far the most negatively affected group at the local level. The loss of customary livelihoods, often with limited to no compensation. And when compensation did come, it was often poorly governed at the local level, where you get a lot of elite capture, and those directly suffering very negative livelihood consequences often did not benefit from those payments, or payments were highly uneven in the same landscape. And there were also limited opportunities to offset those losses through different opportunities that might come through the emerging biofuel industry. So replacement land that was provided to those land-losing households was either limited in extent, very far from the household, creating an additional labor burden, or of very poor quality. And there was also a fairly prevalent practice of preferring migrants from outside the local communities who had experience in waged labor for plantation employment over those who were most negatively affected by plantation expansion. And then other benefits not directly going to those who were most negatively affected. Now, I'm going to include a case study at the risk of biasing this toward the negative, because it's an illustration of the kinds of things that we need to try to avoid in putting safeguards in place, irrespective of where these developments are playing out. This is from a case study done in Ghana, and for the case of Jatropha, where 67% reduction on average of household land holdings was incurred by those affected by plantations. And the land recovery rate 2 years after land loss was about 12.5%. And that land recovery rate was 6 times lower for recent migrants than for those who had customary land rights. And so there can be biases as well within the local community. 50% of households are reporting reduced land quality of those who actually did manage to secure replacement land. And interestingly, the net value of all employment, if you consider the entire plantation area at the time of research, relative to the net value averaged over all of the different land uses, was roughly equal to the value of the main cash crop, which is yam. But when considering all of the other land uses that were displaced, and including other cash and staple crops as well as forestry-related uses, there's a number of very highly valuable non-timber forest products in this area, then the net value of employment is far less than the land uses that were displaced. And if you consider differentiated effects by land-losing households, we found that there was a roughly the value of employment to land-losing households was about 2.5% the original value of yam only for households on average, because only 4% of households actually had one family member who managed to secure employment. And then this was expected to drop to about 35% of current levels over time as plantations mature and the more labor-intensive period of cultivation has passed. So you see that benefits cannot be assumed for these local households. And since this is such a main driver of the push for biofuel expansion in a number of host countries, it's important to proactively assess these costs and benefits. Looking now to small-scale growers, concrete benefits, again, were observed in well-established oil palm industries. In Indonesia, high numbers of respondents reported increased income, and a significant number increased access to food. So food security improving for some, but not for all. And also ease of management of oil palm plantations once they're established. So you see a voluntary shift of many farmers toward oil palm, and almost exclusively oil palm in the case of Malaysia, given the attractive livelihood opportunities this provides. But in uncertain or in emerging industries, for example, the Jatropha industry in Africa, smallholders were found to bear the risk of uncertain agronomics for a crop that's essentially still wild, and different business models that have yet been proven in practice for a number of years, which I'm not going to go into right now due to time. Barriers to entry into the market were identified as well in some sites, despite supportive government policies to proactively engage the small-scale farmer. And this has a number of reasons, but one of them is that there's higher transaction costs for purchasing companies to engage many smaller-scale operators than few larger-scale operators. And so a lot more needs to be done to overcome that bias. Looking at food security, which is an issue of very widespread concern, we found that this idea that biofuels are targeting marginal land is at present largely a myth. This is again based on select case studies, but we did not find that to be the case anywhere. The primary impact from commercial plantations, of course, is due to this displacement of customary land uses, an increase in landlessness, due to direct displacement as well as to increase in property values, and also increased reliance on purchased foodstuffs. And small-scale growers also, we found a lot of evidence to suggest that staple and cash crops are being displaced by jatropha, both in permanent fields and shifting agricultural systems, but interestingly in Mexico also in prime irrigated cropland. However, smallholders had a host of mechanisms that they used to buffer those effects, so that on average, very low numbers of households were reporting net negative impacts on household food security. That included integrating jatropha into existing cropland, putting jatropha in cropland that's a bit degraded, and displacing and moving those crops to more fertile land. I have one more minute and one more slide. Implications for governance of some of these findings. As far as avoided deforestation, certainly in most countries there's a need for stronger regulation of large-scale producers and stronger support to raise smallholder yields so that per unit of fuel that's produced you have a lower environmental footprint. And then the critical importance of full carbon accounting, as we saw by the presentation from Neil, considering both direct and indirect land use change. And recent papers suggest that indirect land use change is not trivial. It can significantly alter the ultimate assessment of whether biofuels have net positive or negative climate mitigation potential. And then also a second area where concerted policy attention is needed is in the area of protecting vulnerable groups. And this is for both production systems, both commercial agriculture and smallholders. The first is in the area of controlled expansion of outgrower schemes, so that there's importantly proof of concept prior to engaging, in the case of Zambia, upwards of 50,000 households in up to 30-year contracts before you even have a working production system that's proven to work agronomically or economically. But then also in terms of looking at terms of contracts so that these relationships are not abusive. And then protection of customary land users. We have done some work that's not reported here looking at legislative protections on customary landowners in the context of large-scale land acquisition. And there's a lot of improvements that can be made there. That's on the CD-ROM that I hope you'll pick up on your way out if you didn't on the way in. And also importantly, improving the quality of the negotiation process. And one thing that we need to highlight is that there are a lot of expectations that people have going in that are often very unrealistic. And those expectations will probably remain no matter how well the governance is working. And so something needs to be done as far as expectation management so that people are getting into mutual agreements of mutual benefit. And finally, how to leverage more meaningful benefits, not just mitigate the cost, but actually leverage benefits for local people. Certainly, a lot of improvements can be made in terms of preferential hiring and benefit flows to those most negatively affected. Most importantly, customary rights holders and land-losing households. But then also policies and services to overcome barriers to market entry, for example, requiring either at the pump or among investors that a certain amount of feedstock be sourced from small-scale farmers. And then finally, finding creative ways to reconcile formal employment with traditional land uses, so it's not either food production or regular income flows, but somehow both can be sustained. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Our next speaker is Dr. Pablo Pacheco. Pablo leads CIFOR's research in the area of globalized trade and investment. And Pablo will present now more of our findings with regard to governing biofuels, regulations, and market-based governance systems. Pablo.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I want to bring to your attention part of the research that our team has been doing related to the governance of biofuel development from two different angles. What's the role that state regulations are playing and market-based mechanisms in shaping biofuel development in the countries. Three are the messages that I want to highlight in these my presentations. And the first one is that the governments have played only a very marginal role in the developments of biofuel sector in developing countries. But there are very few exceptions, and one of the main exceptions is probably Brazil and some other countries in Latin America, like Argentina or Colombia. Then the second message that I want to highlight is that for biofuel development to develop in a sustainable way and to avoid the negative impacts of these developments, there have to be clear regulatory frameworks, but also there is a need of having a wider cross-sectoral coordination. And the third point that I want to highlight is that market-based instruments are also critical to enhance the governance of the biofuel sector. However, the adoption of these instruments is limited. So this is calling back for the role of the state. And now there is this emergence of this, what is called these hybrid approaches that we have to explore further and see what are the positives of implementing these approaches for enhancing governance. We have been looking at 6 case studies, which are the same countries that Laura mentioned in his presentations, and looking at the role of the legal and institutional frameworks in these countries. And what we can see is that, for example, in Africa, in Ghana and Zambia, there has been an important process of land acquisition for from investors from the north, targeting jatropha. However, the rates of expansion of development of jatropha plantations has been very slow, and in some cases these investors have been shifting to produce food crops. The case of Indonesia and Malaysia is a bit different. As you know, Indonesia and Malaysia are the largest oil palm producers in the world. And even though the fact that they have installed a significant production capacity for biodiesel, because of different factors that are related with policies in another sector, the subsidies for the gasoline and for the differential effects of prices of oil and oil palm. So the actual biodiesel production in these countries is very limited. So they have not been able to meet the targets that they set up for biodiesel. Then Mexico is a different case because the policies were mainly targeting jatropha expansion, but the developments in practice have been very, very slow and very linked to state incentives for jatropha. And as you know, Brazil is the country which has set up the most ambitious targets, blending targets, and has become one of the most largest producer and exporting countries in the world. This table is just for you to have an idea of the differences in terms of incentives that countries have been adopting, but also the important differences that exist between what Brazil has been doing regarding what some other countries in Africa, for example, have been doing. However, the rationale that's behind for the development of the sector, as all of you know, is basically how to promote biofuels as a way to reduce the vulnerabilities to oil prices. So this idea that attracting foreign investments could help to revitalize the agricultural sector and enhance the incomes for rural producers. However, the differences in terms of the incentives that countries have been using are enormous, not into what Brazil has been doing with a very systematic policy that has been evolving over time to shape the development of bioethanol and lately from biodiesel in the Amazon. So what are the main trends? And I think when we start to compare the countries, it's important to understand that probably in Brazil, the government has been very instrumental in driving the sector development, but supporting the both sides, production and consumption, and this is probably the most important lessons that we can draw from the Brazilian experience. And when we saw the other countries, the government is playing almost a very little role in driving the development of the sector, and which is mainly driven by the perceived opportunities in the global markets. So the investors and the private sector have been very responsive to the investment climate conditions in the countries, and also to the market conditions, in national and international. And you have countries like Ghana and Zambia that have been very attractive for investments because several conditions, agroecological conditions, and other incentives for attracting foreign investments. However, the institutional conditions in these countries are not allowing for a much more benefit capture of these investments. So looking across the different cases, the governments face important difficulties for monitoring the social and economic impacts of these investments and for holding these investors accountable. So there are three main unresolved governance issues when we look at the biofuel development sector in these countries. One is related to local tenure rights, the second to smallholder participation and inclusion, and the third has to do with the environmental protection. One of the main issues regarding to local tenure rights is this tenure insecurity, that in many cases there is this risk of loss of rights from local populations to investors, and also the fact that states are not investing enough to protect the rights that have been transferred to local populations, and in some cases the states are playing a very active role in negotiating these land transfers to investors. With regard to smallholder participation, even though the fact that some countries have been putting in place programs to involve smallholders, like JATROFA programs, in most of the cases they have failed. And when we look at other countries like Brazil and Indonesia that also have been trying to put in place important efforts to include smallholders in the value chains, these efforts have important problems also to meet their targets. And with regard to environmental protection, it's very much known that in some cases the governments have been also targeting areas with low populations that also are areas that have important forest resources for agro-industrial expansion. So that's the case of Indonesia, in many cases in Africa. And another important factor is these ambiguous regulations for land use and the limited capacity that the states have to enforce these regulations. And another exception that we have to make here is the case of Brazil, where the capacity of enforcing land use regulations has improved a little bit in the last time. And also there is the fact that this environmental impact assessment is being seen as the most important tool for regulating these investments, but there are many factors that are undermining the effectiveness of these instruments. So in this context, it's important scope for market-based instruments, and as you may know, and as has been mentioned before, there has been an important proliferation of these market-based instruments for regulating finance, as John William was saying, production and trade. So corporate codes of conduct, sustainability standards, certification and labeling. I'm not going to point out what are the problems or opportunities that each of these standards are bringing. So we have a specific research on this that if you are interested, you can go to look at. But what's interesting to mention is this move to these more hybrid approaches, and what the EU has been trying to do, to link the procurement policies with the adoption of voluntary certification standards. But however, this has some problems because this has very limited, in some cases, it's limited in its scope. And the other problem is that there are alternative markets which cannot impose the same requirements. And also at the level of producer countries, there are cases, and I want to to highlight, for example, the case of the soy moratorium in Brazil, where the industry has been using the regulations adopted by the state to enhance the governance of soybean expansion in the Amazon, which has been relatively a successful case on how one commodity in a specific scale and territory can be governed. So there are important opportunities for improve the governance of the sector in the consumer countries, expanding the scope of the regulations, including social standards, enhancing the geographical or expanding the geographical coverage, including non-EU consumer market requirements. At the level of the producer countries, there are also important opportunities. But the thing is that what can be done in context of very weak state enforcement capacity of the states. So, but there's still some things that can be done. Also enhancing the investment conditionalities, or trying to put in place policies like Brazil has been trying to do for demanding a specific percentage that industries have to buy from smallholders to get access to incentives. And, but also there, I think there's important actions that can be done at the level of the civil society. You know? And I think one important factors that, or actions that can be improved is how to disseminate and make the information more transparent. And I think that's another important lesson, I think, that's coming from the Brazilian case. How to make information available to the society can be beneficial for the whole governance of the sector and the territorial governance of the Amazon. So those are the points that I wanted to share with you.
Many thanks, Pablo. Last but not least speaker is Dr. Graham von Maltitz. Graham is a senior researcher at the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research here in South Africa. And Graham is going to present an overview of biofuel development in sub-Saharan Africa, trends, impacts, and policy options.
Evening all. I'm going to speak specifically around issues relating to Africa, and I think there's a number of really good reasons why we should focus on Africa in this regard with biofuel. One of them being that Africa has been a bit of a late player in the biofuel arena, and this is both advantageous and disadvantageous. It gives us the opportunity to learn from what's happened elsewhere, hopefully not to make some of the same mistakes, but equally it means that Africa potentially is missing out on opportunities if there are indeed good opportunities for development to be had in biofuels. I'm going to speak just to 4 slides. I know I'm the last speaker of the session. Looking at the background to biofuel in Africa, just a little bit of history, the way I've seen it evolving from my perspective. But then asking the critical question, if Africa engages in biofuel, why should it be engaging in biofuel? What should it want out of its engagement in biofuel? And I think this differs quite substantially, for instance, from what Europe might be wanting out of biofuel. It's only once you understand why you would engage in biofuel that you can then start saying, what would you do to try and enhance those benefits that you can achieve? And just to pick up on some of the options, and it'll be just an overview of some of the options available, potentially to move biofuel development in Africa in a way that will be more beneficial to the continent. And then finally, just to go back and look very briefly at some of the trends we've seen in the evolution of the policy environment relating to biofuels in Africa. So just a little bit of background. If we go back to, say, 2005, when the sort of whole biofuel revolution was starting, and we look what was going on in Africa, or even if we look at where the situation stands today, as was portrayed, I think, in Francis's early graph, Africa doesn't even sit on the graphs when it comes to biofuel production. The line of biofuel coming out from Africa is so thin it's not worth putting on the graphs. Having said that, bioenergy is a very important aspect in Africa. Most of Africa is still fueled off traditional energies, charcoal or fuel wood. From an investor perception, I think investors have seen a growing market, particularly the EU market. This might or might not be true in terms of a real market, but certainly early investors saw this as a market potential. They also, I think, saw Africa as potentially a quick profit because land is cheap, often freely available to investors, and the perception as well that there's a lot of available labor. So what was happening is investors were coming through to Africa requesting land, often requesting very large areas of land. And in a sense, the African countries were taken by surprise. They didn't have a biofuel policy in place and a mechanism to effectively respond to these requests for land. This resulted in what has been mentioned in the media and in some of the publications as a land grab, a situation of investors acquiring large tracts of land, not totally for biofuel, some of it for food production, but certainly a lot of it being driven as land being acquired for biofuels. What we've seen is two sort of parallel models emerging in the way that investors have tried to engage in the biofuel market. The one model is the sort of large farm estate model, investors acquiring tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of hectares, and certainly in many cases the investors have requested way more than they've actually been granted of land. There's been a sort of corporate type arrangement, a forestry if you want to, or corporate plantation arrangement, planting large amounts of biofuels in a fairly mechanized way for, in most cases, the idea of the export market. In some cases, we've also seen an alternative of small-scale growers, and particularly related to Jatropha, investors basically trying to persuade a whole lot of small-scale growers to produce the biofuel on their behalf, and I think Laura spoke quite a bit about that earlier. That's been the main trend. There's also been a very small counter-trend to that, a trend led largely by NGOs, where biofuels have been grown for local use, in other words, to be used by the farmer or the local community for local fuel generation, maybe local lighting. What we've seen across the board is actually a slow uptake. Even where investors have acquired large tracts of land, the rate of planting on that land has typically been way slower than certainly than the investors were promising the governments in many cases. We've also seen almost a total focus on Jatropha in the terms of the projects that have actually been initiated, though to a lesser extent there is interest in alternative crops, particularly sugar, to a lesser extent palm oil, with talk about cassava and some other crops as feedstocks. Particularly in the case of Jatropha, what we've seen to date is largely a failure of the projects, and I think there was a question around that earlier. The reasons for this are, I guess, fairly complex, partly due to economic issues, particularly related to the global crisis, financial crisis. But I think largely it is purely that Jatropha has failed to give the yields that were expected. There was clearly a lot of misinformation around Jatropha in the early days, a lot of false expectations of where it would go, what yields it would produce. So, not saying that Jatropha might not work, but clearly where you take wild seeds without any agronomic trials, without any species site matching, and you use that to base an industry, it's tended not to have the results that were expected. So having looked at a bit of background, what should Africa be looking at from biofuels? What's important to Africa? And there's been a number of policy level engagements in Africa, also a number of studies. And I think the thing that comes out clearly is where the EU might be looking at biofuels from a climate change perspective, from an African perspective, it's livelihoods and economic development that is the core reason that countries want to engage in biofuels. And I think here you can unpack this a lot, and there's a lot of complexity, but clearly there's a desire for countries for a national level economic growth being driven by biofuels, but there's also a need for local rural development to be driven by biofuels. And these issues, though they might be complementary, aren't necessarily complementary. And again, as Laura's pointed out, in a number of cases, a number of local social issues can occur through the large-scale expansion of biofuel. The other issue as to why African countries are starting to want biofuel is for their own local energy provision and energy security. Fuels, particularly liquid fuels, are a huge component of most African countries' GDP expenditure. This is money leaving the country directly. If they can produce their own fuels, they can dampen themselves against changes and fluctuations in fuel prices, and obviously save on foreign expenditure. The other thing that I think is clear is that there's a need to attract appropriate investment. The investment needs to be investment that grows the country, where money sticks in the country and has overall economic benefit to the country. And then there's obviously issues about sustainability. The climate sustainability is one issue, but I think there's a whole host of other land use sustainability issues that are important. For instance, issues such as biodiversity and ensuring that biodiversity is protected, and obviously food security. Looking at this, we identify a large number of ways in which African countries can move biofuel development to better achieve their objectives. The one is changing the mix between small and large-scale farming, and this would largely be needing the country to set the right incentives, the right mechanisms to change the ratios. And this might well require the development of a viable small-scale farming sector. Equally important is local beneficiation. It makes no sense to export raw material without beneficiation within the country. That's clearly not adding a lot of value to the country. Also, there's the need for national use of fuels, rather using the fuels as national energy rather than purely just exporting either processed or unprocessed feedstock. There's also some opportunity to link to local level household fuel security. It would be crazy if African countries are providing Europe with fuel while local people are still using traditional fuels as their key source of fuel. And then there's also a need for strategic planning and tested technologies, clearly a problem in the case of Jatropha. The policy response that we've seen from Africa, there's a move to the development of national policies. A number of different issues clearly differentiate different policies in different countries, but introduction of, for instance, blending targets to ensure holding some of the fuel in the country, development of sustainability criteria in some countries, particularly Mozambique being a good example, investment frameworks. In some cases, we think probably very loose investment frameworks that are trying too hard to bring in investment rather than ensuring it's the correct sort of investment, and land use zoning. Also, there's been regional-wide initiatives. The one we're most familiar with is the SADC level initiatives. SADC has developed planning tools on behalf of the SADC countries. It's also developed a number of sustainable criteria guidelines for the countries. Parallel to this, there's the development of international certification guidelines, which we see are having an impact on African countries. So I think what we've seen is a move toward a controlled development, but clearly it's a sort of movements in the right direction, but a long way to go, very complex trade-offs being involved in the whole biofuel initiative, and a lot of African countries suggesting that they really struggle with the capacity to really be able to deal with these hugely complex issues. Thank you.
Many thanks, Graham. Without further ado, because we've received information that we need to vacate this room by, I hope, 7:10, which does give us about 17 minutes for our question and answers. Before I open the floor, there was a lady from Wildlife International. I haven't forgotten you asked a question that Marco deflected. So I'd like to ask perhaps Laura if you would like to respond in terms of whether there are any examples from the research in terms of successful stories.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks, Andrew. I think I may have partially addressed the question already. But if I think the question was, are there cases where you get net social and ecological, social benefits as well as strong environmental controls or mitigating negative environmental impacts? And if I'm to answer it that way, then I have to immediately go to Brazil, which is really the one case that's been relatively successful in mitigating negative environmental impacts. So I'm restricted in my choice to Brazil. And then as far as livelihood benefits, certainly there are benefits, but the main constraint perhaps being this question of the scale of operators that are effectively penetrating the market in Brazil. And certainly more needs to be done to enable the entry of smaller scale operators. The maximum level of landholding that can qualify for the social seal program is 100 hectares, and so there's an incentive for operators to minimize their transaction costs, to go with settlements with larger numbers of larger scale land holdings than the very small or the very poor. So those are challenges perhaps that remain. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, can we have any more questions? Yes, Annie?
Thank you very much. I don't know, hello? Yeah. I was really impressed by the hugeness of the work that you've done, and it's obvious to me that both Pablo and Laura, we only got a tiny taste of what you've done, and I'm very excited to see those detailed reports. But without putting words in your mouth, it seems to me that if we're going to look at examples of where we get the greatest benefits, we're not really looking at the plantation models, because that very often results in the loss of the land and very few jobs, as Laura said, and I think some of your work, Pablo, also shows that. My question really is about how do we make sure that we support the smallholder programs, because it seems that the greatest benefits come from that. Now, some of you gave some examples of some ways we could do this. But I'm aware that, in Brazil there are some criticisms even of the social seal program, that it hasn't really resulted in a huge expansion of the smallholder programs. You talked about some ways you could do this. I've had some knowledge of what they've been doing in Southeast Asia around palm oil in terms of organizing farmers. To me, it seems that that's really where we need to go to, not at the end of at the point of sale, but maybe at the point at which the smallholders need to be supported, to be organized. I'd really like to hear your opinions on how you think we could make that happen.
Thanks very much, Annie. I'll take up to 2 more questions with the time we've got. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, for Torsten from PFC, the world's largest forest certification system. Following up directly on this question and the question of smallholders, PFC was founded and established by smallholders, so we are very aware of the importance of working with smallholders. The other word I've heard quite often in a few presentations was of course, certification itself. And of course, the obstacles to certification, the direct and indirect cost, resources, capacity building, and so on. Now, certification is especially difficult for those smallholders. But the bullet points that I've heard were the consumer market-driven sustainability criteria, EU RED, and so on, which I believe mainly look at what can be delivered from plantations, what can be delivered from large landowners, and not necessarily what can be delivered from small forest holders or from smallholders. Perhaps even with detrimental effects of driving smallholders out of the market because they can't satisfy procurement policies. How do you see this conflict perhaps being able to be solved?
Is there another question at the back, please?
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Laura and all the presenters for very good presentations. I think, for me, what has come out of these various presentations is that one of the key issues is that Jatropha in Africa is really a failure. And so we must really be cautious about the development of Jatropha or do away with it completely. And I think the other thing is that Africa needs to take a precautionary approach in any large-scale biofuel development. But my question, and I guess this goes to all of you panelists, is these are very key findings that you've come up with, and I would want to know how you're driving this message into the negotiations that are going on, and where you think you have made some progress in terms of pushing this issue forward. Thank you.
I'm going to ask first Pablo if he would like to respond initially to Annie's question in relation to the attempts, for example, Pablo, that have been made in Brazil under the small farms policy to try and protect small owner interests, and then Laura.
Actually, that's a very difficult question that I think is at the center of the debates of rural development. How smallholders can be promoted in order to enhance the livelihood opportunities that they may have from agriculture and outside of agriculture. So I think I really don't have a conclusive answer for these. But I think there are many different ways which can be, or policies that can be used to support the smallholder production. And one is through how to facilitate public services to smallholders. I think Brazil's experience is interesting to the extent that the state has been investing in research and transfers of technology and research to smallholders. It's a few countries in which I have seen that the state is still taking the responsibility for transferring technology to smallholders. And also, it's also a few places in which I have seen that the state also take the, it's not responsibility, but have explicit policies to transfer cheap credit for smallholders, for example. I think those are ways, and also, and there are different ways. I think that even though this experience of the social fuel stamp can be heavily criticized because it didn't achieve the outcomes that they wanted to achieve, and instead they ended up favoring the soybean industry in Mato Grosso instead of favoring smallholders in the Northeast. But I think there's still thinking on how to adjust the mechanisms that could favor the development of smallholders, or how to include still smallholders into the system. So I think that, and what's important is to, I think, to have a closer look at these experiences to see what has really failed and what kind of services these smallholders they were requiring, besides the fact of just putting the legal provision of that industries they have to buy. And then basically how to make investments in improving the value chains also. Those are something.
Thanks, Pablo. Laura, do you want to add a comment in terms of the African experience?
Yeah, thanks very much for an interesting set of questions. As far as supporting smallholder programs, I think smallholders need a number of things, number of services, credit extension, as well as marketing support. The question is who gives those services. I think in the African context, the quality of government support services to the smallholder sector is very limited, very weak. And so in that context, I think a lot of people are looking to the private sector to say, can the private sector provide these services? And in some cases, such as South Africa, you see that model emerging in the forestry sector, plantation sector, for example. So it would be interesting and important, I think, to do a comparative analysis in different contexts where you have strong and weak government capacity for the quality of services that can actually revitalize and mobilize a smallholder sector. That's a study that very much needs to be done, but C4 has not done it yet. So I put that out there as kind of next steps for us and others. but also there needs, if the private sector is to play a role, there needs to be a change in the structural conditions that drive, and economic factors that drive the practices and behaviors of large-scale operators. So if they're having trouble sourcing from smaller-scale operators, what can be done? What kind of incentives or rules can be put in place? And I'm just thinking, you know, back to the role of market-based instruments. Governments can set the rules, but they're having a very hard time with enforcement of those rules. So can they be rule setters? And can some of the voluntary instruments demand compliance with national laws? And a lot of them do at the moment, but some don't. And that is, I think, it's potentially a powerful hybrid instrument for further engagement of smallholders and provision of those services. Another thing is political will. A lot of incentives are being given to large-scale operators, tax incentives, what have you. Land is being given away for free. A lot is being given out without a lot of expectations or monitoring of investor performance in return. I'm talking more about the African context. What, compared to that, is being given to the smallholder? I think we really need to scrutinize that and encourage a more meaningful investment. I hear over and over again that investment in smallholders is the role of the private sector, not necessarily government. And that, I think, needs to be scrutinized further, given all the incentives that are given to larger operators. I've run out of time.
Yeah, I think, Laura, we can cover some of the other questions. I mean, just one last point. I think it's important to also point out that the experiments with Jatropha have not been restricted just to sub-Saharan Africa. There have been trials in China and also in Mexico and many other countries. But I think the results are fairly similar. But to get it back to the other questions, perhaps, Graham, would you like to respond to the question regarding the role of certification as an instrument to try and promote the interests of smallholders?
I mean, clearly the issue of certification for smallholders is hugely complex. Who carries the cost of it? And I think some of the arguments go back to the issues that Laura was talking about earlier. Probably one of the best ways is working through the large companies. In many cases, you need large anchor projects to get the volumes, but you might, or either you need or you can create through legislation a situation where the additional volume has to come from smallholders. So I think one of the best ways is to put the burden on the processors, on the companies, to ensure that the smallholders are part of the certification system.
Thanks, Graham. I've seen one more question, and I'm going to keep the last question so that each of the panelists can give us a 1.5-minute response to that last question, but I saw the gentleman had one more question.
Okay, I'm Gustav Melin. I'm president of the European Biomass Association. I would like to comment on Jatropha and also make a question. I think it's too early to say that Jatropha is a failure. It has been planted a lot around the issue that it is not food. It's not possible to use for food, and it can be used on degraded land and not that good land. And that is a problem, I think, that now when there is not really a market for biodiesel from Jatropha and the industry is not there to produce the biodiesel, then it's not possible to sell it on the food market. Maybe for small farmers, farmers' cooperatives could be a way to make the investment in smaller biodiesel units, but then you still need 2,000 cubic meter per annum to produce, and it's small, to have lower cost. But I would say or believe that in many of the African countries there is not a market really yet. It's difficult to compete with the diesel or the gasoline. So I would ask if you believe that it's possible to create the demand on the market so that it could be a little bit more profitable. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I've just been given a signal. We have 4.5 minutes. So I'm going to try and combine those last two questions because they're both related to Jatropha, and ask each of the panelists to comment on whether Jatropha, it is too early to consider it as a failure, and what needs to be done to try and improve some of the experience from Mali and other countries where, at a small scale, I think there has been some success. And then coming back to the earlier question, how has this research been used in terms of furthering the discussions, or I think the question that was asked was negotiations, and where has this been used to make some progress in promoting biofuels? So Pablo, you don't want Pablo, great, so we've saved 1 minute. Laura.
Okay, on the Jatropha question, I think Zambia provides a very good natural experiment. Fuel prices in Zambia are almost twice of what they are in South Africa. So in Zambia, you can say the demand is there, the economic incentives should be there. And I really believe it's a supply issue. There is not sufficient supply of Jatropha seeds at this stage because of very, very low production rates. Just on how this is used from the one side, from our side, we've engaged very strongly with the SADC policymakers and tried to carry a lot of our research findings through to the SADC policymaking team.
Laura, do you want to make a last comment?
I just wanted to go back to an earlier comment about drawing on the certification question. We just did a study of the initial 7 voluntary schemes that were approved by the European Commission for verifying compliance with the Renewable Energy Directive. And we're able to look at the certification instruments and how they've kind of equipped themselves to respond to that opportunity. And I would say that from what we can say at this very, very early stage, that's a very powerful driver of behavior, the criteria within consumer markets. And currently, however, the Renewable Energy Directive does not have any social sustainability criteria. Some of the voluntary instruments do. We have folks here from RSB, and theirs is probably the strongest of what we've seen. However, the lack of these, so my thinking is that there's potentially an opportunity there to leverage far greater benefits, social benefits, but it's not exploited at the moment, and specific design criteria would have to be explored in practice.
Many thanks, Laura. And I think if you would all join me in thanking our presenters,